My daughter said, "Don't touch anything." So I touched her wedding dress with spaghetti sauce. The words still taste like bitter medicine on my tongue, even 3 years later. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share with anyone. And if you, for even a second, feel like this story sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Evelyn Margaret Henderson. I'm 76 years old, and I live in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, where the L train rattles my windows every morning at 6:47 a.m. like clockwork. My hands shake more than they used to. Arthritis, the doctor says. But they still know how to fold in prayer, still remember how to turn the worn pages of my leather-bound Bible that's been with me for 43 years. This morning, like every morning for the past decade, I woke before dawn and made my way to the little kitchen table where I keep my devotional book stacked beside a ceramic mug that reads, "World's Greatest Mom," a Mother's Day gift from 1987 that's chipped around the rim but still holds my coffee just fine. The apartment smells like lavender potpourri and yesterday's pot roast, mixed with the faint scent of the vanilla candles I light every evening when I pray for my daughter Emily. I opened my Bible to Psalm 27, the same chapter I've been reading for comfort lately. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" But as I whispered those familiar words, my voice caught in my throat, because fear had become my closest companion these past few years. Not fear of death or illness or poverty. I'd made peace with all of that long ago. No, this was a different kind of fear. The fear that comes when the person you love most in this world looks at you like you're a stranger, like you're an inconvenience, like you're something to be managed rather than cherished. My reading glasses sat crooked on my nose as I traced the verses with my finger, the same way I used to trace bedtime stories for Emily when she was small. Those were simpler times, when her biggest worry was whether the monsters under her bed were real, and I could chase them away with a kiss on her forehead and a whispered prayer. Now the monsters were real, and I couldn't protect her from them because I had become one of them in her eyes. The phone rang at 8:23 a.m., jolting me from my morning prayers. I knew it was Emily before I even looked at the caller ID, because my heart always skipped that particular beat when she called, which wasn't often anymore. Maybe once a month if I was lucky. Usually to ask about my health insurance or to remind me about some family obligation I was expected to fulfill without being truly welcome to participate in. "Mom," her voice came through the speaker, crisp and professional, the same tone she used with her colleagues at the marketing firm in downtown Chicago where she'd worked her way up to vice president. There was no warmth in it, no trace of the little girl who used to call me Mama and climb into my lap during thunderstorms. "I need to talk to you about the wedding." The wedding, Emily's second wedding, scheduled for next month in the ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel. Her first marriage had ended 3 years ago when her husband Paul, a man who'd never liked me from the moment we met, had left her for a younger woman from his office. I'd wanted to comfort her then, to hold her while she cried and remind her that God's plan was bigger than her pain. But she'd shut me out, spending her grief in expensive therapy sessions instead of in prayer, in wine bars instead of in church. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, settling back into my chair and pulling my worn cardigan tighter around my shoulders. "What about the wedding?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that feels heavy with unspoken words. I could hear her taking a breath, the way she always did when she was about to deliver news she knew would hurt. "I need you to understand something, Mom. This wedding is going to be different from what you're used to. Thomas and we're having a very modern ceremony. Very elegant. The photographer we hired has worked with celebrities, and there will be people there from my company, important clients. Everything needs to be perfect." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I understand, honey. I just want you to be happy." "That's just it, Mom. I need you to promise me something. No religious talk during the reception. No trying to say grace before dinner. No pulling out your rosary or trying to lead people in prayer. And please, for the love of God, don't touch anything." The florist spent hours arranging everything. The caterer has a specific setup. And my dress, it's a designer gown that cost more than most people make in 6 months. I just need you to come, sit quietly, and let me have this day without any complications. The words hit me like a physical blow, each one carefully chosen to make me understand my place in her new life. I wasn't her mother in this equation. I was a potential source of embarrassment that needed to be managed and contained. I was the reminder of a simpler, more faithful life that she'd outgrown like childhood clothes. "Emily," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I raised you in the church. I taught you to pray. I know what you taught me, Mom, and I'm grateful for the foundation you gave me, but I'm not that person anymore. I've grown. I've evolved, and I need you to respect that this is my day, not yours." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone in my hands. The coffee had grown cold in my world's greatest mom mug, and the morning sun streaming through my window felt harsh instead of warming. I thought about all the times I'd stood at Emily's bedside when she was sick, pressing cool washcloths to her fevered forehead and singing hymns until she fell asleep. I remembered teaching her to make my grandmother's spaghetti sauce on Sunday afternoons, her small hands struggling to stir the heavy pot while I guided her from behind, both of us laughing when she got more sauce on her apron than in the bowl. Those memories felt like photographs now, faded and distant, evidence of a relationship that existed more in my heart than in reality. The little girl who used to beg me to tell her Bible stories at bedtime had become a woman who was embarrassed by the very faith that had shaped her character. The daughter who used to hold my hand during church services now saw my beliefs as primitive superstitions that might contaminate her sophisticated new life. I picked up my Bible again, turning to Proverbs 31, where it talks about a virtuous woman whose children rise up and call her blessed. But as I read those familiar words, all I could think about was how my own child seemed to see me as anything but blessed. She saw me as a burden, a relic from a past she'd rather forget, a mother whose love came with too many conditions and too much faith attached. That night, I lay in my bed listening to the sounds of the city, sirens in the distance, neighbors arguing through thin walls, the constant hum of traffic on Lakeshore Drive. I pressed my rosary beads between my fingers and prayed for understanding, for patience, for the strength to love my daughter even when she made it clear that my love was unwanted. I prayed for the wisdom to know how to be the mother she needed me to be, even if that meant becoming someone I didn't recognize. But mostly, I prayed for the grace to survive whatever was coming next, because deep in my heart, I knew that the worst was yet to come. The wedding invitation arrived 3 weeks later. Elegant cream cardstock with gold foil lettering that must have cost more than my monthly grocery budget. My name was printed at the bottom in small, reluctant letters. Evelyn Henderson, not beloved mother or mother of the bride, just my name, like I was any other guest who might or might not show up. I held that invitation in my trembling hands and remembered another invitation 23 years ago, when Emily graduated valedictorian from DePaul University. I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for her education: cleaning offices at dawn, serving tables during lunch rush, and stocking shelves at the grocery store until midnight. My feet were so swollen I had to soak them in Epsom salt every night, but I never missed a tuition payment. Never once. The night before her graduation, Emily had called me crying. "Mom, I can't afford the cap and gown rental. It's $200, and I already spent my last paycheck on interview clothes for next week." I remember hanging up that phone and opening my Bible to Philippians 4:19. "But my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in glory by Christ Jesus." Then I walked to my dresser, pulled out the small jewelry box where I kept my wedding ring and the pearl necklace my mother had given me, and drove them to the pawn shop on Western Avenue at 11 p.m. The man behind the bulletproof glass offered me $150 for both pieces, a fraction of their worth, but enough to cover Emily's graduation expenses with money left over for a celebration dinner. I never told her where that money came from. I just said, "God provides, sweetheart. He always provides." At her graduation ceremony, she walked across that stage in a pristine cap and gown, summa cum laude, her future bright as the Illinois summer sun. When they called her name, I stood up in the back row and cheered so loud that people turned to stare. Emily found me afterward, threw her arms around my neck and whispered, "Thank you, Mama, for everything. I promise I'll take care of you when I'm successful." I promise I'll never forget what you sacrificed for me. But promises are like morning mist. Beautiful in the moment, gone by noon. Emily's success came quickly. She landed a job at a prestigious marketing firm, moved into a Lincoln Park apartment with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows, started dating men who wore expensive suits and drove cars that cost more than my annual income. She'd invite me to dinner occasionally, but always with a list of instructions. Don't mention church, Mom. Don't talk about Dad's accident. Don't bring up anything depressing. These people are important for my career. I learned to swallow my stories, to smile and nod when her friends talked about their latest vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. I learned to order the cheapest item on menus where appetizers cost more than I spent on food in a week. I learned to be grateful for the crumbs of attention she threw my way, because even crumbs were better than the starvation of complete abandonment. When Emily met Paul during her 3rd year at the firm, I knew immediately that I'd lost her completely. Paul looked at me like I was something unpleasant he'd stepped in, his nose wrinkling slightly whenever I spoke. He had opinions about everything. My clothes were dated, my neighborhood was sketchy, my faith was quaint but impractical in the modern world. During their first Christmas together, I'd saved for months to buy Emily a beautiful cashmere scarf I'd seen her admiring in a shop window. I wrapped it carefully in paper I'd pressed smooth and reused from the previous year, tying it with a ribbon I'd saved from a gift my neighbor had given me. When she opened it in front of Paul, he laughed and said, "Oh, how sweet. Very grandmother-ish." Emily's face flushed red, not with anger at his cruelty, but with embarrassment at me. That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed through tears. Lord Jesus, help me understand. Help me love without expecting love in return. Help me give without keeping score. But please, please don't let me become invisible to my own child. The irony was cruel. The harder I prayed for her, the further she seemed to drift from everything I'd taught her. She stopped coming to Christmas Eve service at St. Mary's, the church where she'd been baptized, confirmed, and had once volunteered to help with the children's ministry. She stopped calling on Sundays, knowing that was when I attended Mass and might want to share what Father Murphy had preached about. She even stopped saying "God bless you" when people sneezed, as if acknowledging the divine had become beneath her new social status. But I kept praying. Every morning at dawn, every evening before bed, and countless times throughout each day. I prayed for her soul, for her happiness, for her future children, for her marriage to Paul, even though he treated me like an unwelcome intruder in my own daughter's life. I lit candles at church, dropped my meager widow's pension into the offering plate, and asked the prayer circle at St. Mary's to remember Emily in their intercessions. "Mrs. Henderson," Father Murphy had said to me one Sunday after Mass, his kind eyes full of concern, "You look tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" I'd forced a smile and nodded, but the truth was that I was dying inside, slowly, quietly, like a plant that stops getting water but tries to survive on hope alone. The apartment felt too big and too empty. Meals tasted like sawdust when you had no one to share them with. Television shows lost their humor when there was no one to laugh alongside you. Emily's wedding to Paul had been a lavish affair at the Drake Hotel. 300 guests, an 8-piece orchestra, and flowers that cost more than most people's cars. I'd worn my best dress, navy blue with small pearl buttons that I'd bought for my own wedding 37 years earlier, and sat in the 3rd row, not the front where mothers typically sit, because Paul's family needed those seats for important business associates. During the ceremony, when the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, I'd bitten my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Not because I objected to their love, but because I objected to the way Paul had systematically erased me from Emily's life, convincing her that faith was weakness, that family obligations were burdens, that the woman who'd sacrificed everything for her daughter's success was now an embarrassment to be managed and minimized. The marriage lasted 4 years. 4 years of rare phone calls, missed birthdays and holidays spent alone while they traveled to exotic locations, I saw only through Emily's carefully curated social media posts. When Paul finally left her for his secretary, a predictable cliché that would have been funny if it hadn't broken my daughter's heart, Emily called me at 2 a.m. sobbing. "Mom," she'd whispered through her tears, "I think I made a mistake. I think I lost myself somewhere along the way." I'd driven to her apartment immediately, still in my nightgown and slippers, carrying nothing but my purse and my Bible. I'd held her while she cried, stroked her hair like I used to when she was small, and whispered the same prayers over her that I'd been whispering for years. But when morning came and her tears had dried, the walls went back up. "Thanks for coming, Mom," she'd said, her voice already returning to that cool, professional tone. "I think I just need some time to figure things out on my own. Figure things out on her own." As if the woman who'd raised her, guided her, prayed for her every single day of her life had nothing valuable to offer in her darkest hour. Now, staring at this new wedding invitation, I wondered if I was strong enough to watch her make the same mistakes again. Thomas seemed different from Paul. Quieter, kinder, less concerned with impressing people. But Emily was still the same daughter who saw my faith as primitive superstition, my love as suffocating obligation. I set the invitation on my kitchen table and opened my Bible to Isaiah 49:15. "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you." But as I read those words, a terrible thought crept into my mind like poison. Am I being tested? Or just forgotten? The question hung in the air of my small apartment, mixing with the scent of yesterday's coffee and the faint aroma of the lavender sachets I kept in my drawers. Outside my window, Chicago continued its relentless pace. People rushing to jobs that mattered, families gathering for dinners filled with laughter, children being tucked into beds by parents who would be remembered with gratitude instead of shame. And here I sat, 76 years old, wondering if the greatest love of my life had become my greatest source of sorrow. The day I arrived to help with Emily's wedding preparations, I found myself standing on the doorstep of her new Lincoln Park townhouse at 7 a.m., holding a pot of my famous spaghetti sauce like an offering to a god who'd already rejected me. The sauce had been simmering since 4 in the morning, the same recipe I'd taught Emily when she was 12, made with San Marzano tomatoes I'd splurged on because this was supposed to be special. Emily answered the door in a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her hair already in curlers, her face bearing that look of barely controlled irritation that had become her default expression whenever I appeared. "Mom, you're early," she said, not moving aside to let me in. "The wedding planner isn't here yet, and I specifically said 8 a.m. I thought I could help with breakfast. Maybe start organizing." "No." The word came out sharp as a slap. "Everything is already organized. The caterer is handling breakfast. Just come in and sit somewhere out of the way until we need you." I followed her into the house, marveling at the marble countertops and crystal chandelier that caught the morning light like trapped stars. This was the life my sacrifices had bought her. Beauty beyond anything I'd ever known, comfort I'd never been able to provide for myself. And somehow, instead of feeling proud, I felt smaller with each step across her polished hardwood floors. The house buzzed with activity. A makeup artist unpacked brushes and palettes worth more than my monthly grocery budget. A hairstylist tested hot tools and sprayed products that smelled like expensive flowers. 2 women in matching black outfits arranged flowers with scientific precision, each bloom positioned according to some aesthetic equation I couldn't understand. I set my pot of sauce on the kitchen counter, and Emily's eyes immediately fixed on it like it was a spider she needed to kill. "Mom, what is that?" "Your favorite sauce. I thought we could serve it with. We have a catered menu. Everything is planned." She moved the pot to a back burner, tucking it behind other appliances like a dirty secret. "Please don't interfere with anything else." I spent the next 4 hours invisible in my own daughter's house. I sat on the edge of a cream-colored sofa, afraid to lean back and leave impressions on the perfect cushions. I watched strangers fuss over my daughter's appearance, while she laughed and chatted with them about people I'd never met, places I'd never been, experiences that had nothing to do with the life we'd once shared. When her phone rang, Emily glanced at the screen and smiled wider than she'd smiled at me all morning. "Thomas, perfect timing. We're almost ready for photos." She walked away, leaving me sitting alone while she discussed final details with her fiancé. Her voice warm and animated in a way I remembered from her childhood, but hadn't heard directed at me in years. Around noon, Emily's maid of honor arrived, A thin woman named Jessica with perfect teeth and a designer handbag that matched her shoes. She embraced Emily like they were long-lost sisters, then glanced at me with polite confusion. "And you must be my mother," Emily said quickly, the words delivered with the same enthusiasm someone might use to identify a stain on their clothing. Jessica's smile became slightly strained, the way people's faces change when they're forced to acknowledge something unpleasant but socially necessary. "Oh, how lovely. Emily's told me so much about you." But I knew she hadn't. Emily never talked about me anymore. Never shared stories from our life together. Never mentioned the woman who'd raised her. I was a footnote in her biography, an embarrassing chapter she preferred to skip over when telling the story of her success. During the photo session, I was positioned at the very edge of family pictures, practically cropped out of frame. The photographer, a young man with aggressive enthusiasm and an expensive camera, kept adjusting my position further and further to the side. "Just a little more to the left, Mrs. Henderson, right? Perfect. We want to make sure everyone fits." But fitting felt like disappearing. In photo after photo, I became smaller, more peripheral, until I might as well have been a piece of furniture that happened to be wearing a dress. The breaking point came when Emily pulled me aside after the photos, her face tight with barely controlled frustration. "Mom, I need you to understand something. Tonight is very important to me. Thomas's family will be there. His father is a federal judge, his mother sits on 3 charity boards. My colleagues from work, the senior partners from Thomas's law firm, these are people who matter." "I understand, sweetheart." "No, I don't think you do." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "I need you to promise me you won't embarrass me tonight. No talking about church, no mentioning Dad's accident, no stories about the old neighborhood. And please, for God's sake, don't try to say grace or pull out that rosary. These people are sophisticated. They won't understand." Each word landed like a physical blow. The church where I'd found comfort in my darkest hours was an embarrassment. The accident that had taken her father, my husband, was a shameful secret. The neighborhood where I'd raised her with love and prayers was something to be hidden like a criminal record. "Emily," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "I'm not trying to embarrass you. I just want to be part of your happiness. Then be part of it by staying quiet and staying out of the way." After she walked away, I found myself standing alone in her guest bathroom, staring at my reflection in a mirror framed with lights like a movie star's dressing room. The woman looking back at me was 76 years old, wearing a dress I'd bought at Sears 3 years ago, holding a faith that apparently had no place in her daughter's new world. I pulled my rosary from my purse, the same beads I'd prayed with through Emily's childhood illnesses, her teenage heartbreaks, her college struggles. I held them against my chest and whispered the "Our Father," but for the first time in my life, the words felt empty, like speaking into a void that had no interest in listening. That afternoon, while Emily was getting her hair styled, I walked through her house looking for any trace of the daughter I'd raised. No family photos on the walls, just abstract art that meant nothing to anyone. No Bible on her nightstand. Just best-selling novels about women who found themselves through expensive therapy and exotic travel. No cross hanging anywhere. Just minimalist decorations that spoke of success, but not soul. In her bedroom closet, I found her wedding dress hanging like a cloud made solid. The price tag was still attached. $8,500. More than I'd spent on all my clothing in the past 5 years combined. The fabric was exquisite, hand-beaded with pearls that caught the light like dewdrops on spider webs. I reached out slowly, reverently, the same way I used to touch her forehead when she had fevers. My fingers barely grazed the hem, and suddenly I was transported back 25 years to a small apartment on the south side, where I'd spent weeks hand-sewing a communion dress for 8-year-old Emily, working by lamplight after my shifts at the diner because we couldn't afford to buy one ready-made. "Do you like it, Mama?" she'd asked when I'd finally finished, twirling in front of our cracked mirror while the white cotton flowed around her like angel wings. "You look beautiful, baby girl, like an angel sent straight from heaven. Will Jesus think I'm pretty in it?" "Jesus thinks you're beautiful no matter what you wear, sweetheart. But this dress shows everyone how special you are to him. Now, touching this expensive gown that had been purchased instead of made with love. I wondered when Jesus had been evicted from my daughter's heart. When had faith become something to be ashamed of instead of celebrated? When had the mother who'd sewn her first holy garment become someone too primitive to touch her wedding dress? That evening, I sat at the reception in the Palmer House ballroom at a table near the kitchen, surrounded by Emily's elderly relatives who'd also been relegated to the social periphery. Uncle Harold, her father's brother, who still smelled like the auto shop where he'd worked for 40 years. Aunt Martha, who'd never married, and whose conversation rarely extended beyond her cats and her arthritis. We were the remnants of Emily's past, gathered in exile while she celebrated her future with people who'd never known the girl who used to make snow angels and beg for bedtime stories about baby Jesus. During the dinner, I watched my daughter laugh with her new husband's family, watched her charm his colleagues with stories about her career achievements, watched her transform into someone I barely recognized. When the toasts began, person after person stood to praise Emily's intelligence, her ambition, her success. No one mentioned her character. No one spoke about her capacity for love. No one acknowledged the values that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. And when Thomas's father, the federal judge, raised his glass and said, "To Emily, who's proven that with enough determination, anyone can rise above their circumstances," I felt something crack open inside my chest. Rise above their circumstances. As if loving her had been a circumstance to overcome. As if the faith that had sustained us through poverty and loss was something shameful to escape from. That night, back in my apartment, I knelt beside my bed and tried to pray. But for the first time in 76 years, the words wouldn't come. I held my rosary until my fingers cramped, but heaven felt sealed shut above me, God's silence more deafening than any storm. "Are you there?" I whispered into the darkness. "Are you listening? Because I don't know how much more I can take." The only answer was the sound of my own heartbeat and the distant rumble of the L train carrying people to destinations that mattered, to lives that had meaning, to relationships that brought joy instead of endless, aching sorrow. The morning after the wedding, I woke to 17 missed calls on my phone. 17. I stared at the screen through eyes swollen from a night of tears, my arthritic fingers struggling to scroll through the list of angry voicemails from Emily, Thomas, and people whose numbers I didn't even recognize. The first message was from Emily, her voice shaking with a rage I'd never heard before. "Mom, what you did was unforgivable. Unforgivable. Do you understand what you've cost me? The photographer wants to charge extra to edit the photos. Thomas's mother hasn't stopped asking questions. You've humiliated me in front of everyone who matters in my life." I sat on the edge of my bed in my threadbare nightgown, holding the phone like it might explode, trying to piece together what had happened after I'd left the reception early with a splitting headache and a heart too broken to pretend anymore. The second message was from Thomas, his voice carefully controlled but ice cold. "Mrs. Henderson, I think we need to have a serious conversation about boundaries. What you did last night was completely inappropriate. Emily is devastated. What I did. But what had I done except exist in a space where my existence was unwelcome?" The third message was from Jessica, Emily's maid of honor, her voice dripping with the kind of false concern that wealthy women use when they're delivering social death sentences. "Evelyn, honey, I think you should know that people are talking. What happened last night? Well, it's raised some questions about your mental state. Emily is worried about you. We all are. Mental state. As if loving your daughter too much was a form of insanity." I finally gathered the courage to listen to Emily's final message, left at 2:47 a.m. "I can't do this anymore, Mom. I can't keep making excuses for you. I can't keep pretending that having you in my life doesn't complicate everything. Maybe we need some space. Maybe a lot of space." The phone slipped from my trembling hands and clattered onto the hardwood floor, the sound echoing through my small apartment like a gunshot. I stared at it lying there, this device that had just delivered my exile from the only family I had left, and wondered if this was how God felt when humanity stopped calling his name. 3 hours later, Emily arrived at my apartment unannounced, her face a mask of controlled fury. She didn't wait for me to invite her in. She simply pushed past me into my living room, her designer heels clicking against my worn linoleum like a countdown to execution. "We need to talk," she said, standing in the center of my small space like a queen surveying a peasant's hovel. "About what happened last night. Emily, sweetheart. I honestly don't understand what— Don't!" She held up her hand like a traffic cop. "Don't pretend you don't know what you did. The spaghetti sauce, Mom. You touched my wedding dress with spaghetti sauce." The memory came flooding back like a dam bursting. After the reception, after watching my daughter celebrate with people who saw me as a relic from her embarrassing past, I had indeed gone to see her dress one more time. I had touched it, not with sauce on my fingers, but with hands that remembered sewing her first communion dress, hands that remembered braiding her hair, hands that remembered everything she wanted to forget. But the sauce. Yes, there had been sauce. I'd been cleaning up my pot from the back burner where she'd hidden it, and when I'd reached out to touch the dress, to feel connected to my daughter one last time, my fingers had still been damp from washing the pot. 3 small drops, barely visible, on a dress that cost more than most people's cars. "It was an accident," I whispered. "Emily, I was just trying to feel close to you." "I never meant— You never mean anything, do you, Mom?" Her voice rose to a pitch that reminded me of her toddler tantrums, except now the words cut deeper than any childish anger ever could. "You never mean to embarrass me. You never mean to make everything about you. You never mean to ruin the most important day of my life." "I didn't ruin anything. It's just a small stain that can be—" "It's not about the dress," she screamed, and I saw my neighbors' curtains twitch in their windows. "It's about you not knowing your place. It's about you thinking that because you're my mother, you have the right to touch everything in my life, to insert yourself into every moment, to make my wedding about your feelings instead of my happiness." Each word landed like a physical blow. I sank into my worn armchair, the same one where I'd rocked her to sleep as a baby, where I'd helped her with homework, where I'd prayed for her every single night of her life. "Emily," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I love you. Everything I've ever done has been because I love you. Your love is suffocating." She shot back without hesitation, as if she'd been rehearsing this speech for years. "Your love comes with conditions. Your love requires me to be someone I'm not anymore. Your love demands that I stay small, stay grateful, stay trapped in the same small-minded world where you've always lived." Small-minded. The words hit me like a physical slap. Was faith small-minded? Was sacrifice small-minded? Was loving your child more than yourself a sign of limited thinking? "I never asked you to stay small," I said, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I only wanted to stay close." "Well, I can't do both." She pulled out her phone and showed me something that made my blood freeze. "Do you see this? This is Thomas's mother's Instagram post from last night. Look at the comments." I squinted at the small screen, reading words that turned my stomach. Who's the old woman in the background? Why does she look so out of place? Is that the mother? Yikes. Someone should have helped her dress appropriately. Thomas's family is questioning his judgment for marrying into this. Emily gestured around my apartment with disgust. His mother asked if you have dementia. His father suggested I might want to consider guardianship options for you. Guardianship. They wanted to declare me incompetent because I'd accidentally stained a dress while trying to feel connected to my daughter. "Emily, please, we can work this out. I can apologize to Thomas's family. You can what, Mom? Become a different person? Erase 40 years of being exactly who you are? Stop believing in fairy tales about God and Jesus? Stop talking like someone from the South Side? Stop being embarrassing?" The questions hung in the air between us like weapons. She wanted me to become someone else entirely, to abandon not just my faith, but my very identity, the woman who had shaped her into the person she'd become. Would Jesus forgive this too? I asked quietly, more to myself than to her. Should I forgive again? Emily's face contorted with something that looked almost like hatred. There you go again, making everything about your religion, using Jesus as emotional manipulation. Do you know how exhausting it is to have a mother who thinks she's a martyr? A martyr. As if loving unconditionally was some kind of performance, some elaborate show designed to make others feel guilty rather than a simple expression of a mother's heart. I'm not trying to be a martyr, Emily. I'm trying to be your mother. Well, maybe that's the problem. She moved toward the door, her hand already on the knob. Maybe I don't need a mother anymore. Maybe I need space to build a life without constant guilt trips and religious lectures and reminders of how much you've sacrificed for me. She paused at the threshold, not looking back. I think it's best if we don't see each other for a while. A long while. Until you can figure out how to love me without trying to control me. The door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed like thunder in my suddenly empty apartment. I sat in my chair for hours after she left, staring at the space where she'd stood, replaying every word of our conversation. Outside my window, Chicago continued its relentless pace. People going to work, children playing in parks, families gathering for Sunday dinner. Life moving forward while mine seemed to have stopped completely. Around sunset, my phone rang again. This time it was my nephew David, Emily's cousin, calling from Milwaukee where he worked as a mechanic and raised 3 kids on a modest income. Aunt Evelyn. His voice was gentle, concerned. I heard about what happened. Emily called my mom and she's pretty upset. David? I don't know what to do. I don't know how to love her in a way she can accept. Maybe that's not your job anymore, he said quietly. Maybe your job is just to love her and let God handle the rest. You taught me that when my dad was drinking, remember? You said sometimes love means stepping back and praying instead of trying to fix everything. His words reminded me of something I'd forgotten in my desperation to remain relevant in Emily's life. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is release someone to find their own way back to grace. Would it help if I came down for a visit? David asked. Maybe we could go to Mass together like we used to when I was little. You always said that's where you found your peace. Peace. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly peaceful. But maybe David was right. Maybe it was time to stop fighting for my place in Emily's life and start fighting for my own soul. I'd like that, I whispered. I'd like that very much. As I hung up the phone, I realized something that shocked me. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. Somewhere in Milwaukee, a young man who'd learned about faith and forgiveness at my kitchen table was dropping everything to come sit with a broken old woman who'd lost her way. Maybe God hadn't abandoned me after all. Maybe he was just speaking through different voices now. David arrived on a Tuesday morning carrying a thermos of coffee and a smile that reminded me of his father before the drinking took him. He was 34 now, with calloused hands and grease under his fingernails, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. He looked at my apartment, really looked at it, and his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in so long I'd almost forgotten what it looked like. Genuine affection. Aunt Evelyn, he said, setting down his thermos and opening his arms wide. You look like you could use a hug from someone who remembers what you did for our family. I fell into his embrace and cried for the first time in weeks. Not the silent, ashamed tears I'd been shedding alone, but deep, cleansing sobs that came from a place I'd forgotten existed. David held me without judgment, without trying to fix anything, just letting me grieve for the daughter I'd lost and the woman I'd forgotten I used to be. She called me selfish, I whispered against his shoulder. She said my love was suffocating. Emily's forgotten a lot of things, David said quietly. But that doesn't make them less true. Do you remember when my dad lost his job at the plant? You came to our house every Sunday for 2 months with groceries, and when my mom tried to pay you back, you said the only payment you wanted was for us to pass it forward someday. I did remember. I remembered David's mother crying at her kitchen table, trying to figure out how to feed 3 growing boys on unemployment benefits. I remembered the way David's eyes had lit up when I'd brought his favorite cookies, how he'd helped me carry the bags from my car, chattering about school and baseball and his dreams of fixing cars when he grew up. You taught me that love isn't about keeping score, David continued. You said God's love doesn't come with receipts, so ours shouldn't either. Do you remember that? I nodded, wiping my eyes with the tissue he handed me. So when did you start letting Emily convince you that your way of loving was wrong? The question hit me like a revelation. When had I started believing that my faith was primitive, my sacrifice meaningless, my love insufficient? When had I allowed my daughter's shame to become my own? I don't know, I admitted. Somewhere along the way, I started thinking that if I just became smaller, quieter, less myself, she might love me back. And how's that working out for you? Despite everything, I almost smiled. David had always been direct, even as a child. It was a quality I'd encouraged in him, though Emily had found it crude and unsophisticated when we'd all gathered for family holidays in better times. Not well, I said. So maybe it's time to try something different. That afternoon, David drove me to St. Mary's for the first time in 3 months. I'd stopped attending Mass after Emily's first wedding, too ashamed to face the congregation who'd watched me raise her, too embarrassed to answer questions about why she never visited anymore. But walking into that familiar sanctuary, breathing in the scent of incense and old wood and candle wax, I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in years. Father Murphy was finishing his afternoon prayers at the altar. When he saw me, his weathered face broke into a smile that reminded me why I'd always felt safe in this place. "Evelyn," he said, approaching with the unhurried pace of someone who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. "I've missed seeing you here. I've missed being here, Father. I didn't know if I belonged anymore." He studied my face with the gentle perception of someone who'd spent 40 years listening to confessions and drying tears. "Would you like to talk?" "Not confession," he added quickly, seeing my hesitation. "Just talk. Sometimes that's what we need most." In his small office behind the sacristy, surrounded by shelves of theology books and photos of parishioners' weddings and baptisms, I told Father Murphy everything. About Emily's shame, about the wedding dress, about being called small-minded and suffocating. I told him about the silence I'd been feeling from God, about prayers that seemed to bounce off the ceiling, about wondering if I'd somehow failed both as a mother and as a Christian. Father Murphy listened without interrupting, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Evelyn," he finally said, "do you know what the hardest part of my job is? It's not delivering last rites or comforting the grieving. It's watching good people torture themselves for loving too much instead of too little." He leaned forward in his chair. Jesus was rejected by his own people. He was called a troublemaker by those he came to save. He was told his love was inconvenient, his message outdated, his presence embarrassing to those who wanted to appear sophisticated. Does that make his love wrong? "No," I whispered. "Then why does it make yours wrong?" The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I'd been too afraid to cross. "But what do I do, Father? How do I love her without losing myself?" "You remember who you are," he said simply. "You remember that you're not just Emily's mother. You're Evelyn Henderson, daughter of God, woman of faith, survivor of 40 years of widowhood who raised a successful daughter despite having every reason to give up. You're the woman who taught Sunday school for 20 years, who brought groceries to struggling families, who prayed the rosary in hospital waiting rooms with strangers who needed comfort." As he spoke, I felt something stirring in my chest. Not the desperate, clinging love I'd been offering Emily, but something stronger and more grounded. Self-respect, dignity, the knowledge that my worth wasn't determined by my daughter's approval. "What would happen," Father Murphy asked gently, "if you stopped trying to earn her love and started simply living your life?" That evening, David and I sat at my kitchen table eating the spaghetti I'd made with the sauce Emily had rejected. It tasted like memory and comfort, and the kind of simple pleasure I'd forgotten I was allowed to enjoy. "I've been thinking about what Father Murphy said," I told David as we shared the last of the garlic bread, "about living my life instead of just reacting to Emily's rejection. What would that look like?" I thought about it, twirling pasta around my fork. I don't know. It's been so long since I made decisions based on what I wanted, instead of what might make Emily approve of me. "Well," David said, reaching for his wallet, "let's start small." He pulled out a business card and handed it to me. "My friend Maria runs a grief support group at the community center in Pilsen. It's not religious exactly, but she says a lot of people find comfort there. People who've lost children, spouses, parents, people who understand what it feels like when love isn't enough." I studied the card. Healing Hearts Support Group, Tuesdays, 7 p.m. The address was only 20 minutes from my apartment. "I'm not sure I'm ready to talk to strangers about—" "You don't have to talk," David interrupted gently. You just have to show up. Sometimes that's the hardest part. That night, after David had returned to his hotel, I sat in my armchair with my Bible open to Isaiah 43:4. Since you are precious and honored in my sight, and because I love you, I will give people in exchange for you, nations in exchange for your life, precious and honored. When was the last time I'd felt precious to anyone? When was the last time I'd honored myself, instead of diminishing my own worth to make others comfortable? I picked up my phone and, for the first time in 3 months, deleted Emily's number from my recent calls. Not to be cruel, but to stop the compulsive urge to reach out, to beg for scraps of attention, to apologize for existing. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I ordered takeout from my favorite Chinese restaurant without worrying about the cost, without calculating whether the money might be better spent on something Emily might need. I ordered what I wanted, ate it while watching an old movie I enjoyed, and went to bed without checking my phone to see if Emily had called. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. The next morning, I woke up and made a decision that would have terrified me a week earlier. I was going to that support group, not because David suggested it, not because Father Murphy thought it was a good idea, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be around people who didn't see my love as a burden to be managed. As I dressed for the day, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at me was 76 years old, with silver hair that caught the morning light and eyes that had seen heartbreak but hadn't lost their capacity for hope. She was wearing a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes and a small gold cross that had been her mother's. She looked like someone worth knowing. "Hello, Evelyn," I said to my reflection. "It's nice to see you again." And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I meant it. That Tuesday evening, I drove to the community center in Pilsen, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel, but my heart steady with purpose. I was done shrinking myself to fit into Emily's vision of who I should be. I was ready to remember who I'd always been, and maybe, just maybe, to discover who I could still become. The support group at the community center in Pilsen became my lifeline over the following weeks. Maria, the group leader, was a woman in her 50s who'd lost her teenage son in a car accident and understood the particular grief that comes when love is met with absence. The circle of folding chairs held stories that made my heart ache: parents who'd lost children to addiction, spouses forgotten in nursing homes, adult children who'd cut off contact over money or politics, or simply the exhaustion of dealing with aging parents. But there was also something else in that room: strength. The kind of quiet resilience that comes when you've survived your worst fear and discovered you're still breathing. These people had learned to love without conditions, to hope without guarantees, to find peace in the space between what they'd given and what they'd received in return. 3 weeks into my Tuesday evening routine, as I was walking to my car after group, my phone rang. Emily's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel my stomach clench with desperate hope. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, Emily." "Mom." Her voice was different somehow, less controlled, more fragmented. "I need to see you. Can I come over tonight?" "It's almost 9 o'clock, sweetheart. Is everything all right?" "No, everything is not all right." There was a crack in her composure that I hadn't heard since she was a child. "Thomas and I had a fight, a big one, about you, actually. Can I please come over?" I looked up at the Chicago skyline, lights twinkling like earthbound stars, and felt something solid settle in my chest. Not the desperate eagerness I would have felt a month ago, but a calm certainty. "Of course you can come over. This is your home too, always. But, Emily, we need to have a real conversation. Not about Thomas, not about the dress, but about us. About how we treat each other." There was silence on the other end, then a small sound that might have been a sob. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." She arrived 40 minutes later, looking nothing like the polished professional who'd stood in my living room a month ago delivering ultimatums. Her makeup was smeared, her expensive blouse wrinkled, her hair escaping from its usually perfect arrangement. She looked, for the first time in years, like someone who needed her mother. But I also looked different. I was wearing the blue dress that made me feel confident, the gold cross that connected me to my faith, and something new, a quiet dignity, that came from 3 weeks of remembering who I was beyond Emily's opinion of me. "Thank you for letting me come," she said, standing awkwardly in my doorway like a stranger seeking shelter. "Sit down, honey. I'll make us some tea." As I moved around my small kitchen, preparing the chamomile tea she'd loved as a child, Emily sat heavily on my couch and began to cry. Not the angry tears from our last confrontation, but the exhausted sobs of someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. "Thomas thinks I'm heartless," she said when I handed her the steaming mug. "He said that the way I treat you shows him exactly what kind of person I really am. He said he's having second thoughts about our marriage." I sat in my armchair, the same one where I'd rocked her to sleep as a baby, and studied my daughter's face. She was 34 years old, successful beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible, married to a good man who loved her, and she was miserable. "What did you tell him?" I asked quietly. "I told him you didn't understand boundaries. I told him you were manipulative and guilt-inducing, and that I had to protect myself from your neediness." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "And he said that wasn't the woman he'd heard about from David." David. My nephew had been in contact with Thomas, sharing stories about the aunt who'd helped raise him, who'd taught him about faith and sacrifice and unconditional love. He said David told him about how you supported our family when Dad lost his job, how you never asked for anything back, how you taught us that love doesn't keep score. Emily's voice broke. "And Thomas asked me when was the last time I'd shown you that kind of love." I sipped my tea and waited. This wasn't the time for me to rescue her from her discomfort or to minimize her pain. This was the time for truth. I couldn't answer him, Mom. I couldn't think of a single time in the past 5 years when I'd put your needs before my own convenience. And then I realized, I don't even know what your needs are anymore. I stopped asking. "Emily," I said gently, "do you remember what you asked me when you were 8 years old, right after your father died?" She shook her head. "You asked me if God still loved Daddy even though he was gone. And I told you that God's love doesn't depend on whether we're perfect or whether we make mistakes. I told you that love, real love, doesn't have conditions." I set down my teacup and looked directly into her eyes. "I've loved you unconditionally for 34 years. But somewhere along the way, I started believing that your love for me did have conditions, that I had to earn it by being smaller, quieter, less myself. Mom, I never meant—" "Let me finish, sweetheart." My voice was calm but firm, backed by 3 weeks of rediscovering my worth in that circle of folding chairs. I've spent years apologizing for being who I am, for having faith in a world that calls it primitive, for showing love in ways that embarrass you, for existing in spaces where my presence reminds you of things you'd rather forget. Emily flinched as if I'd struck her. "But I'm done apologizing for loving you. I'm done making myself smaller so you can feel bigger. I'm done pretending that my faith is something to be ashamed of instead of the foundation that kept us both standing when your father died." I reached for my Bible on the side table and opened it to Matthew 10:37. "Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. For years, I've loved you more than I've loved God, more than I've loved myself, and that wasn't healthy for either of us." Emily stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or embarrassment, but something that looked almost like recognition. "I forgive you for being ashamed of me," I continued, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my cheeks. "I forgive you for treating my love like a burden. I forgive you for asking me to abandon everything that makes me who I am in order to fit into your life, but I won't enable you anymore." "What does that mean?" she whispered. "It means I won't apologize for my faith anymore. It means I won't pretend to be someone I'm not to make you comfortable. It means if you want me in your life, you get all of me, the woman who prays the rosary, who goes to Mass, who believes that God's love is bigger than your embarrassment." I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd raised her with love and prayer and the kind of stubborn hope that only mothers understand. "And it means that if you can't accept that woman, then we need to stop pretending we have a relationship. Because I'd rather be alone with my dignity than surrounded by people who see my love as a flaw to be managed." The silence stretched between us like a bridge that either of us could choose to cross or burn. Finally, Emily spoke. her voice so quiet I almost missed it. "I'm scared, Mom." "Of what, sweetheart?" "Of being like you." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for years. "Of loving too much. Of sacrificing too much. Of ending up alone and forgotten despite giving everything to people who don't appreciate it." I turned back to face her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not as the successful daughter whose approval I craved, but as a frightened woman who'd mistaken armor for strength, who'd confused independence with isolation. "Emily," I said softly, "I'm not alone. I have God. I have my faith. I have people in my life who value what I have to give. And yes, I have you, when you choose to show up as yourself instead of as someone who's ashamed of where you came from. But what if showing up as myself isn't enough? What if the real me is someone people don't want to be around?" It was the question that had been hiding beneath all her cruelty, all her shame, all her desperate attempts to distance herself from anything that might make her appear weak or ordinary or human. "Then you'll find out who your real family is," I said, sitting back down and taking her hands in mine. "And you'll discover that being loved for who you truly are is worth more than being admired for who you pretend to be." Emily looked down at our joined hands, mine weathered and spotted with age, hers smooth and manicured. And for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. "I don't know how to do this, Mom. I don't know how to love without keeping score, how to be vulnerable without feeling weak." "Then it's a good thing you have a mother who's been practicing unconditional love for 76 years, I said, squeezing her fingers gently. "But Emily, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to chase you anymore. I'm not going to beg for your attention or apologize for existing. If you want to learn how to love the way I taught you when you were small, I'm here. But I won't sacrifice my peace for your comfort ever again." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Can you forgive me for all of it? For being such a terrible daughter?" "I forgave you before you even asked," I said. "That's what love does. But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to the way things were. It means we start over with honesty this time, with respect for who we both really are." As she cried in my arms for the first time in years, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced in so long I'd forgotten its name. Peace. Not the desperate hope that she might finally accept me, but the quiet contentment that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. I was Evelyn Henderson, daughter of God, woman of faith, and Emily's mother, in that order. And for the first time in years, that was enough. 6 weeks after that tearful night in my living room, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in over a decade. I was genuinely happy. Not the desperate, conditional happiness that depended on Emily's approval, but a deep, abiding contentment that seemed to radiate from somewhere inside my chest, where God's love had finally been allowed to take root again. The change started small. I began attending daily Mass at St. Mary's, not because I felt obligated or because I was seeking comfort for pain, but because I wanted to be there. Father Murphy noticed the difference immediately. "Evelyn," he said after Wednesday morning service, "you look lighter somehow, like someone removed a weight you'd been carrying." "I think I removed it myself, Father," I replied, adjusting the blue scarf I'd bought for myself the previous weekend. The first piece of clothing I'd purchased in 3 years that wasn't on clearance. With God's help, of course. The support group in Pilsen had evolved from a lifeline into a source of genuine friendship. Maria invited me to join the group's monthly service project, and I found myself spending Saturday mornings at a food pantry in Little Village, sorting donations and preparing bags for families in need. It was work I'd done for years before Emily's embarrassment made me withdraw from everything that brought me joy. "Mrs. Henderson," said Rosa, a young mother who came to the pantry regularly, "my daughter asks about you every week. She loves the way you braid her hair while we wait in line." I looked down at 8-year-old Sophia, whose dark curls reminded me of Emily at that age, back when having her hair braided by her mother was the highlight of her day, rather than a source of social anxiety. "Would you like to learn how to do it yourself?" I asked Rosa. "I could teach you the pattern my own mother taught me." As I showed Rosa the simple but elegant braid that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family, I felt something click into place. This was who I was, not just Emily's mother, but a woman with knowledge to share, hands that could comfort, stories that mattered to people beyond my own family circle. David visited again in October, this time bringing his wife Carmen and their 3 children. They stayed for the weekend, filling my small apartment with laughter and the kind of chaos that comes when love overflows the boundaries of careful adult conversation. "Aunt Evelyn," said 10-year-old Miguel, David's youngest, "will you teach me how to make that spaghetti sauce? Dad says it's magic." "It's not magic, sweetheart," I said, lifting him onto a chair so he could help stir the pot. "It's just love and patience and good ingredients. But sometimes those 3 things together can feel pretty magical." Carmen watched from the kitchen doorway, her phone capturing videos of Miguel's concentrate face as he stirred. His siblings arguing over who got to add the basil, David telling stories about learning to cook in this same kitchen 20 years earlier. "You're a natural with children," Carmen said later, as we cleaned dishes while the kids watched a movie in the living room. "Have you ever thought about volunteering with kids? There's a program at our church in Milwaukee that pairs seniors with children who need mentoring." The idea intrigued me. For so long, I'd focused all my maternal energy on Emily, pouring everything into one relationship that couldn't bear the weight of my complete identity. But there were children everywhere who needed what I had to offer, not because they were obligated to love me, but because they could benefit from the wisdom and patience that come with 76 years of living. "Tell me more about this program," I said. 2 weeks later, I enrolled in a mentoring certification class at the community college. The other participants were mostly younger than me, retirees in their 60s, empty nesters looking for purpose, a few college students completing service learning requirements. I was the oldest person in the room, and for the first time in years, that felt like an advantage rather than an embarrassment. "Life experience is our most valuable asset," said the instructor, a social worker named Patricia, who'd been running mentoring programs for 15 years. "The children we work with need consistency, wisdom, and unconditional positive regard. They need adults who understand that love isn't about changing someone into who you think they should be, but about helping them discover who they already are." Her words resonated with something deep in my chest. This was what I'd tried to give Emily, not the conditional approval she'd sought from the world, but the steady foundation of knowing she was loved simply for existing. Somehow, in the process of trying to maintain our relationship, I'd lost sight of the very gift I'd always offered: love without strings attached. The certification program required 40 hours of training over 6 weeks. I learned about childhood development, trauma-informed care, and healthy boundary setting. I practiced active listening and discovered that my years of being Emily's mother, even the painful years, had taught me skills I didn't know I possessed. During our final class, Patricia paired us up for role-playing exercises. My partner was Janet, a retired teacher whose own children lived across the country and rarely called. "I've been feeling so useless," Janet confided during our break. "Like all my experience doesn't matter anymore because I'm not young and energetic like I used to be." "Janet," I said, recognizing my own voice from 6 months earlier, "wisdom isn't about being young and energetic. It's about having lived through enough seasons to know that winter always ends, that storms pass, that love is stronger than disappointment." As I spoke those words, I realized I was finally believing them myself. My first mentoring assignment was with 9-year-old Marcus, whose grandmother brought him to the community center every Tuesday after school. Marcus was quiet and serious, carrying the weight of adult responsibilities that no child should bear. His mother worked 2 jobs, his father wasn't in the picture, and his grandmother was doing her best with limited resources and failing health. "He's a good boy," his grandmother, Mrs. Williams, told me during our first meeting. "But he's so worried all the time. Worried about money, about me getting sick, about whether his mama's coming home safe from work. He's forgotten how to be a child." I understood that worry. I'd carried similar fears as a young mother after Charles died, wondering how I'd provide for Emily, whether my love would be enough to fill the gaps left by loss and limitation. But I'd also learned something Marcus hadn't yet discovered: that worry shared is worry diminished, that faith can coexist with uncertainty, that joy is possible even in the midst of struggle. Marcus and I started slowly. I helped him with homework, read stories together, Taught him card games my own father had taught me during the Depression, when entertainment had to be created rather than purchased. Gradually, his shoulders began to relax, his smiles came more easily, and I caught glimpses of the carefree child hidden beneath his premature seriousness. "Mrs. Henderson," he said one Tuesday afternoon as we worked on a puzzle together, "my grandmother says you lost your husband a long time ago. Were you scared?" "Terrified," I admitted. "I had a little girl to take care of, and I didn't know how I was going to manage everything by myself." "What did you do?" "I prayed a lot. I asked God to help me be strong enough, smart enough, brave enough to give my daughter everything she needed. And you know what I discovered?" Marcus looked up at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for his age. "I discovered that God doesn't usually fix our problems for us, but He gives us the strength to handle them, and He sends us people to help, sometimes in ways we don't expect. Like you helping me with math homework?" "Exactly like that." That evening, driving home from the community center, I thought about the gift Marcus had given me without knowing it. In teaching him that he was worthy of patient attention, I'd remembered my own worth. In showing him that his concerns mattered, I'd reclaimed the validity of my own feelings. In offering him the kind of unconditional care I'd always given Emily, I'd rediscovered the abundance of love that had never really depleted. It had just been redirected toward someone who couldn't receive it. For the first time in months, Emily called on a Tuesday evening, not because she needed something, not because there was a crisis to manage, but simply to check on me. "How was your week, Mom?" she asked. And I could hear something different in her voice, a genuine interest that hadn't been there before. "Wonderful," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of that answer. "I'm mentoring a little boy named Marcus, and today he taught me how to fold paper airplanes. We had races in the community center hallway, and I haven't laughed that hard in years." "You're mentoring someone?" There was surprise in her voice, but not the condescending kind. It sounded more like recognition, as if she was remembering something she'd forgotten about her mother. "I am. Turns out all those years of being your mother taught me a few things about helping children feel loved and valued." There was a pause, and then Emily said something that made my heart skip. "I'd like to hear more about it. Would you like to have dinner this week? Just us?" "I'd love that, sweetheart. But Emily, I'm not going to hide who I am anymore. If we have dinner, you get the real me, the woman who mentors children, who goes to daily mass, who believes that God's love is the foundation of everything good in this world." "I know, Mom. And I think I'd like to meet her, really meet her, instead of just managing her." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and my Bible open to Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future." For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't defining my future in terms of Emily's needs or approval. I was defining it in terms of God's love, my own purpose, and the gifts I still had to offer the world. Emily would always be my daughter, and I would always love her with a mother's fierce, protective heart, but she was no longer the center of my universe. God was in that place now, where He'd always belonged. And from that foundation, everything else, including my relationship with Emily, could finally find its proper, healthy proportion. I was 76 years old, and I was just beginning to understand what it meant to be truly free. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of my small apartment, stirring a pot of my famous spaghetti sauce, while 9-year-old Marcus helped me measure herbs and 10-year-old Sophia, Rosa's daughter from the food pantry, carefully added tomatoes to the simmering mixture. The counter was covered with flour handprints, and the air was thick with steam and laughter, and the kind of beautiful chaos that happens when love overflows the boundaries of careful adult planning. "Mrs. Henderson," Marcus said, standing on his step stool and wielding a wooden spoon with the seriousness of a master chef. "Do you think my mom would like to learn this recipe too?" "I think your mother would love anything that makes you this happy," I replied, adjusting his grip on the spoon. "And I think she'd be proud to know you're learning something your great-grandmother might have taught your grandmother, who might have taught your mother, who can now teach you." The tradition of passing down love through food, it wasn't about the recipe itself, but about the hands that guided other hands, The stories shared while flour settled and sauce bubbled. The way nourishment became both physical and spiritual when prepared with intention and care. Sophia looked up from her careful tomato arrangement. My mama says you're like a grandmother to me, but not the kind that has to be. The kind that chooses to be. The words hit me with the force of revelation. For so many years, I'd believed that love had to be earned, deserved, justified by blood relation or legal obligation. But these children had taught me something revolutionary. The most powerful love is the kind that's freely given, freely received, and freely celebrated without keeping score of who owes what to whom. At 4 p.m., Emily arrived for our weekly dinner, a tradition that had started hesitantly 3 months earlier and had slowly evolved into the highlight of both our weeks. She came through the door carrying flowers from the farmer's market and wearing a smile that reminded me of the little girl who used to race home from school to tell me about her day. "Mom," she said, embracing me with arms that no longer felt stiff or obligatory. "Something smells incredible in here. Marcus and Sophia are helping me make sauce for dinner." "Children," I said, turning to my young assistants, "I'd like you to meet my daughter Emily." Emily knelt down to Marcus's eye level, a gesture I'd taught her when she was barely older than he was now. "Marcus, right? My mom talks about you all the time. She says you're teaching her as much as she's teaching you." Marcus beamed with the kind of pride that comes when a trusted adult speaks well of you to other trusted adults. "I taught her how to make paper airplanes that actually fly instead of just falling down," he announced. "And she taught me that worrying about tomorrow steals happiness from today." Emily glanced up at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Recognition mixed with something that looked like admiration. "That sounds like something my mom would say," she replied. "She's always been good at helping people see what's possible instead of just what's scary." After the children's parents collected them, Marcus with a container of sauce for his family's dinner, Sophia with a carefully written recipe card decorated with her own crayon drawings, Emily and I sat down to eat together at my small kitchen table. "You look different, Mom," she said, studying my face in the soft light from my kitchen window. "Not just happy. You've been happy before, but settled, like you've found your place in the world." I thought about that as I twirled pasta around my fork. 6 months ago, I would have deflected the compliment or immediately redirected the conversation to ask about her life, her needs, her happiness. But I'd learned that accepting praise gracefully was part of honoring the gift God had given me to impact other people's lives. "I have found my place," I said simply. "It turns out my place was never just being your mother, as much as I treasured that role. My place is being Evelyn Henderson, child of God, woman of faith, someone who has wisdom and love to share with anyone who needs it." Emily nodded slowly. "Thomas says I'm different too. Less anxious, less controlling. He says I'm finally learning to receive love instead of just performing for it." Over the past year, Emily's marriage had strengthened in ways that surprised everyone, including her. When she'd stopped trying to manage everyone's perception of her family, she'd found space to actually build the kind of relationships she'd always envied in other people. Thomas's family had embraced her authenticity in ways her performance had never achieved, and their home had become a place of genuine hospitality instead of a showcase for success. "I've been thinking about what you said that night," Emily continued, referring to our confrontation without needing to specify which one. "About how you'd been loving me more than you loved God, more than you loved yourself. I think I've been doing the same thing with everyone in my life, loving them more than I loved what was right, what was true, what was healthy." She paused, setting down her fork. "I want to show you something." Emily pulled out her phone and opened her photos, scrolling to a picture that made my breath catch. It was her spare bedroom, but transformed into something I'd never expected to see in her home. A small prayer corner, a simple wooden cross hung on the wall above a comfortable chair, with a side table holding a Bible. Not the expensive display version she'd once owned, but a well-worn copy with notes in the margins and ribbon bookmarks marking favorite passages. "I started reading again," she said quietly. "Not because I felt guilty, or because I thought I should, but because I wanted to understand what gave you the strength to love so completely, so consistently, even when that love wasn't returned the way you deserved." I reached across the table and took her hand. not grasping desperately, but holding gently, the way I'd learned to hold everything precious, with appreciation rather than possession. "And what did you discover?" I asked. "That love isn't a limited resource, that giving it away doesn't diminish it, that the reason you could love me so much wasn't because I was everything to you, but because God was everything to you, and that abundance flowed down to everyone else in your life." She squeezed my fingers. "I want to learn to love like that, Mom. Not just you, but Thomas, our future children, the people I work with, even strangers who need kindness. I want to love from abundance instead of scarcity." As the evening light faded outside my kitchen window, Emily helped me wash dishes while I told her about Marcus's progress in school, Sophia's dreams of becoming a teacher, the new mentoring program I was helping to develop for teenagers aging out of foster care. She listened with the kind of attention I'd craved for years, not the polite patience of someone enduring an unwanted obligation, but the genuine interest of someone who recognized that her mother's life was rich and meaningful beyond their relationship. When she was ready to leave, Emily hugged me at the door, with arms that lingered, that communicated gratitude and affection, and the kind of respect that can only exist between adults who've learned to see each other clearly. "I love you, Mom," she said. "Not because I have to, not because you're perfect, not because you've earned it by being what I needed. I love you because you're exactly who God created you to be, and being around that authenticity makes me want to be more myself too." After she left, I sat in my armchair with my Bible open to Romans 8:28, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." All things. Even the years of rejection, even the humiliation at the wedding, even the moments when I'd questioned whether love was worth the pain it could cause. God had been working even then, shaping me into someone who could love more freely because I'd learned to love from the right source. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Aunt Evelyn, Carmen and I want you to know that watching you rebuild your life this year has taught us more about faith and resilience than any sermon we've ever heard. Thank you for showing us what it looks like to trust God's plan even when we can't see where it's leading." I smiled, remembering the broken woman who'd sat in this same chair a year ago, wondering if she'd been forgotten by both her daughter and her God. That woman couldn't have imagined the life I was living now, full of purpose, surrounded by people who valued what I had to offer, grounded in the unshakable knowledge that my worth came from heaven, not from human approval. The sunrise through my kitchen window the next morning felt like a promise, painting my small apartment in shades of gold and rose that reminded me why dawn had always been my favorite time for prayer. In those quiet moments before the world woke up, I felt closest to the God who'd never abandoned me, even when I'd thought he'd stopped listening. "Thank you," I whispered, my hands folded around my coffee cup, my heart full of the kind of gratitude that only comes after surviving your worst fear and discovering you're stronger than you knew. "Thank you for not letting me settle for less than your best plan for my life." As I opened my Bible to begin the day, I thought about all the women who might be sitting in chairs similar to mine, feeling forgotten by children they'd sacrificed everything to raise, wondering if their faith was foolishness and their love was wasted. I thought about all the mothers who'd made themselves smaller to fit into their children's vision of respectability, who'd apologized for being who God had created them to be. If I could tell them anything, it would be this: your love is not too much. Your faith is not primitive. Your sacrifices are not forgotten by the one who matters most. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is the example of a woman who knows her worth and refuses to apologize for taking up the space God intended her to fill. Have you ever felt like your love was too much for the people around you? Have you ever wondered if your faith was something to be ashamed of instead of celebrated? Tell me in the comments how your faith has helped you through seasons when love seemed unappreciated. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so we can share this message with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere, there's a mother, a father, a grandmother, a grandfather who needs to remember that God's love for them is bigger than anyone else's rejection. May God bless everyone who's ever loved too much, who's ever been called too much, who's ever been made to feel like their faith is foolishness instead of the foundation that keeps them standing. In Jesus' name, amen.